Doctors who have been in an is anybody here a doctor situation. What happened? My wife and I were waiting for a plane to take off, and they asked for a doc over the intercom. My wife got up and there was a guy lying in the aisle, already dead. She couldn't do anything, had to sign some forms. They got the guy off the plane and made an announcement that the guy was in stable condition, which is technically true for some definition of the word stable. I had a guy die next to me on a plane. They put the oxygen mask on him and pretended he was stable. He was a really large guy and they discussed what to do when we landed. Decided it would be too hard to get him down the aisle with everyone on board, so they emptied the plane first. Not a doctor, but I was on a flight from DC to Chicago and got so sick I passed out upon landing. As I was I was being aided by a man and heard another person shout, "Are you a doctor?" The man helping me replied, "I'm the Surgeon General of the United States." This was Vivek Murthy and it happened around 2015. He was the kindest and humblest guy. I'm currently a first year resident, internal medicine in Sweden. This happened last year, about a year after I graduated, so I was still relatively fresh out of med school. I was flying home from my vacation from the Mediterranean, a 3-hour flight, when they announced on the speaker system that they were looking for a healthcare professional. Stood up when they called out a second time, maybe 15 seconds later. It was me and a bit older nurse who went up to the front rows where a middle-aged male was awake but unresponsive. As I didn't really have a lot of experience and was somewhat panicking, kept the panic internally to myself. It's scary being alone. I fell back to ATLS and eventually noticed that I had a D problem. Decreased strength in one of his arms and one-sided facial droop that was quite mild. Long story short, I suspected a stroke but couldn't really do a whole lot. We were 30 minutes away from landing at the time of the initial call. They didn't deviate or anything. I didn't feel like I did that much, to be honest, except say that I suspected a stroke and asked if they could call an ambulance to the airport. The airplane seemed to land a bit faster than it usually does, and as we went off the runway, there was an ambulance waiting off the taxiway. When the ambulance staff boarded the plane, I gave a short report and that's basically it. I got a thank you from the relatives and the stewardesses. They asked me to write down my name and email, but I haven't heard anything since. Recently, before the coronavirus, I was taking an international flight. The flight attendant asked on if there was a doctor aboard. I was actually asleep, but somehow that woke me up, and I was like, wait, you need a doctor? Turns out a patient was experiencing some diffuse chest pain. Went to examine him and my alarm bells rang when I asked him some questions. I had a very high suspicion that this guy was having an aortic dissection. I told the flight attendant, who passed on the information to the pilot. The pilot made an emergency landing at a different airport, met with an ambulance. I later called the hospital to find out what exactly it was, and turns out I was right. If they had carried on, he might not have survived. Aortic dissection is when the aorta tears is about to burst. Oh my goodness. Great job. You should feel 10/10 proud of yourself every day for the rest of your life. Not a doctor, but story is still relevant in an opposite sort of way. Was watching a children's soccer game. Two 11-year-old girls collided. One got up and her arm was hanging 90 degrees down halfway between her wrist and her elbow. It's not supposed to do that. She continued to play for a second and then realized what her arm was doing. She totally bugged out. She started screaming, "I think something is wrong here." All of the parents are yelling at the girl to take a knee and the ref to stop the game. I jump the fence with another parent. We get her to sit on her knee and rest her broken arm against the bent knee. I yell out, "Where's her parents?" Nothing. "Is anyone here a doctor?" Nothing. At this point it's been like 2 minutes since the original and obvious break. I take my phone out to call 911. 911, hi, what's your emergency? Me, I'm sure you've gotten multiple calls by now, but I just want to make sure. We've got a girl with broken arm here. Has anyone called for an ambulance? 911. No, no one has called. Where are you located? There had to be 500 people watching this game. It was a regional tournament. No doctor, no parent, no one had called 911. About 10 minutes later the ambulance arrived. Mother arrived at the same time. She had to park a mile away. Big tournament, and just finally made it back to the game. Girl gets carted away. The remaining girls somewhat finished the game that had been shortened by 30 minutes due to this incident. Finally the next game starts and I take my seat on the sidelines next to some random parent. Her husband comes up next to us a few minutes later and she turns to him and says, "You missed all of the action. This man," pointing to me, "had to help a girl who broke her arm." "Really?" he says. "That's too bad. I probably could have helped." I turn to him and ask him why that is. "Are you a doctor?" "Yes," he says. "I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon." For frick's sake. The first doctor to show up when it's too late is the most qualified doctor. I just stared at him for a few seconds, mouth agape. He looked at me sheepishly and just said, "I know, right? Don't feel bad. You probably did the same thing I would have done, but I would have known it was the right thing to do." Lesson of the day: the more people around, the more likely that everyone assumes someone else had called 911. TLDR. Child broke her arm in front of me. A child arm fixer doctor happened to arrive just after she was carted off in ambulance. Bystander effect. The greater the number of bystanders, the less likely it is that one of them will help. Something about pointing at people if necessary might force them to actually do something. I was a medical student flying back to start my second year. The flight attendant asks over the PA if there's a doctor on board. Me having finished my first year of medical school stay quiet. A few minutes later, the call goes out again to ask if there's a doctor on board. I decide to go and tell the flight attendant that I'm only a medical student going into my second year and I won't be offended if they say they don't need my services. The flight attendant instead is happy and takes me over to business class where a woman was just coming to after passing out. In my head I'm thinking, oh crap, I haven't seen any patients, and now they're expecting me to perform. As I'm, very nervously, checking her vitals, a licensed physician comes over and tells me to keep continuing with the vitals. He gets me to administer oxygen to the patient and to assess her responsiveness, HR, pulse, etc. It turns out that she had passed out and was a little anemic after further questioning about her medical history. After we took her back to her seat, the physician explained what the issue was. Then he said he'll do the paperwork that the airline required and I was no longer needed. The plane landed at its destination and I ran off to catch my connecting flight. That's awesome that he guided you through it rather than taking over. Sounds like he makes a good teacher. My mom has had to respond twice on flights when someone was in distress. The first time was in the air and a guy was having a diabetic low. She monitored him until we landed. The second time was sitting on the tarmac when a guy had a stroke. They delayed the flight and took the dude off the plane. She also said that after the first one, the airline sent her a thank you card and said please use these enclosed vouchers to get tickets to a destination of your choosing, but they forgot to include the vouchers. She said she thought it would be rude to write back and say hey you forgot the vouchers. That's how they get ya. Also good job on your mom in both cases. While we were on our descent, somebody lurched over in their chair and became unresponsive, tachycardic, and diaphoretic. The whole episode lasted for about 2 minutes. Then he woke up and vomited. I figured he had an arrhythmia and recommended he not take his connecting flight to Cleveland and instead go to the air. Ems was waiting on the ground and helped him off the plane. I actually saw him again on my return flight home. He told me he was diagnosed with an arrhythmia and made an appointment to see a cardiologist in our hometown. A woman was shopping at the grocery store I worked at, with her car parked out front, with her husband in the car, listening to the radio. She went out, couldn't wake him, and came inside asking for a doctor. There wasn't one, but I knew CPR. I performed it until the EMTs showed up, and he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Never saw the woman again, which is unfortunate, because she was definitely a regular, and very pleasant. It probably took a good 5 years before I was able to convince myself that him dying wasn't on me. It was a lot of, what if I wasn't doing it right? Did I miss a step? Was I rushing before I allowed myself to believe that I truly performed my best? That I was likely doing it right, as I did have quite a lot of repeated trainings. My dad was a fireman EMT, and I was a Red Cross certified babysitter, and had to have yearly CPR refresher certifications, and that he just wasn't meant to make it. I was flying out of my home airport during my intern year. I had just finished my cardiology rotation, intensive care, The flight attendant asked for a doctor because a passenger had severe chest pain. It turned out there was also my senior resident and my CCU attending on the same flight, unknown to me. All three of us had worked together for the past 2 months and signed off the CCU the day before. Like a well-oiled machine, we took care of the patient. He was stable thankfully. An ambulance was waiting for him when we landed, and I was very grateful to have both my senior resident and my attending at the time. What a coincidence. Also, because the most exposure I've had to those terms, resident and attending, is via Scrubs, I'm imagining this scene as Dr. Cox, JD, and probably Elliot working together on the patient. Cox probably yelling at Janet to pay some freaking attention or whatnot. Not a doctor, but the patient in this scenario. I was on a long flight, 4 hours, and developed excruciating pain and urge to urinate. Holed up in a washroom for 20 minutes when a flight attendant inquired if I was okay, explained the problem, and they got on the PA system inquiring about a doctor on the flight. The doctor, correctly, suggested I was suffering from previously undiagnosed kidney stones. They passed a 2-liter bottle of water into the washroom and suggested I drink as much as possible. While I didn't pass the stones, the water flushed my kidneys enough to make the balance of the flight bearable. I sought medical attention upon arrival at my destination. I just had a kidney stone about a month ago. In the safety of my own home, it was terrifying. I can't imagine what I'd have done if I was on a plane. Phew. That pain is something freaking else. I was in the car with my mother, who is a doctor, when a bad wreck happened about a mile ahead of us on the road outside town. I didn't see the crash, but all of a sudden we were pulling up to the aftermath, next to a grey blue Subaru that had its entire front pushed in. The woman driving was still in her seat, sitting upright. I couldn't see her feet, but she had bitten clean through her lower lip so that I could see her teeth and gums. Part of her lip was dangling. My mom got out of the car, maybe called 991, I can't remember, and rushed the driver. She put her hands through the windows and held the woman's head and neck completely still while telling her repeatedly that help was on the way and she needed to stay calm and still. It was the most drastic case of code switching ever. My mom is a neurotic, scatterbrained nerd, but as soon as she was out of the car she moved so fast and was so focused. I can't remember how long we waited there before help came and they used the jaws of life to open the car. I do remember very vividly how the firefighter had to move my mom's hands away from the driver for her because she couldn't unlock her hands and arms. Your mum sounds like an utter professional and a total badass besides. Not a doctor, but my daddy's. One time last year he was at a game for our local baseball game, and one of the spectators went into cardiac arrest partway through the game. The whole game stopped. Things went silent as he ran over and assessed the situation before starting compressions. He and the baseball team's doctor kept switching until an ambulance arrived, and I think he ended up being okay. Wow, congrats to your dad. Not a doctor, but I am CPR certified. I work at a gym and a guy passed out after coming out of the shower and people started shouting for someone to help him or find a doctor. Being a stupid teenager, I was too nervous to do CPR. I was scared if I made the situation worse, or what if he didn't need it? So, yeah, I probably should have done more. A few moments later an actual doctor came in. I remember he was naked and looked like Thor. The passed out guy woke up just as Dr. Thor came in though and wanted to leave, but Dr. Thor convinced him to sit down and rest a bit because something had happened to his blood pressure. When your heart's getting tired and weak and you're collapsing towards death, all it takes is one sight of naked Dr. Thor and bam, your heart is pounding and pumping again, rearing to go. I have a doctorate but I'm not a medical doctor. But shortly after receiving my doctorate I was on a transatlantic flight and the flight attendant came around asking if any one of us was a doctor. I, very briefly considered answering jokingly yes, but not that kind of doctor, but the man in front of me said that he was, and as he was leaving with the attendant he said to his wife, I've been waiting my whole career for this. About 15 minutes later he came back, slightly disgruntled. Turned out a woman in first class was having a panic attack, and she ended up with 3 doctors around her all frustrated that they didn't get to do an emergency tracheotomy at 35,000 feet. My friend has had it happen twice to him, both heart related in restaurants. was able to use a defibrillator to save one's life and the other unfortunately passed. Defibrillators don't work if the heart is completely stopped, and CPR is a long shot and didn't work in this case. Many people do not realize that defibs correct the heart rhythm and will not work on anyone whose heart has stopped. I always thought it would shock the heart to start again if it has stopped beating. Not a doctor, but my husband had a seizure in the middle of a very busy shopping center parking lot. It was pretty extreme. A paramedic, a nurse, and nurse practitioner, all off duty, all stopped to help him until the ambulance got there. He came through it, and it was really scary as it was my first experience with a full-blown seizure during our 7 years together. It would have been a whole lot worse if those human angels hadn't rushed in to save us. It has happened to me twice. Both instances were on airplanes. First one, guy developed rashes after eating the airline food. Got to open up the airline's first aid kit. I personally thought it was pretty well stocked. Guy responded to Benadryl. I got bumped up to first class and got a fruit arrangement and a bottle of wine for helping out. Second one, old lady had some chest discomfort and sweating. Pilot, through the flight attendant, asked if we needed to do an emergency landing at nearest airport to offload the lady and her daughter. Patient responded to the nitrates I gave her, and since we were 1.5 hours away from our destination, I told them we could fly as planned as long as they had an ambulance waiting. I stayed with the lady to monitor her with the assistance of the flight attendant who happened to be a nurse. We landed pretty quickly. I think the pilot managed to shave 30 minutes off our flight time, and I am sure we got priority to land because we had some sort of emergency on board. I stayed with the patient until medical personnel came on board to take over. I got bonus miles from the airline. Happened in an airplane. Me, as a 4th grade medical student, and my professor at an airplane for going to a medical congress in our country. A man 50ish years old lost his consciousness. We got there before the cabin crew yelled the situation, had to do CPR for 25 minutes until we have landed at an airport for emergency landing. We still had a 1.5 hour of way, and we also landed off with him to make him reach hospital safely. It was also, I have watched Doogie Howser. Oh my god, it is hilarious. My father, Dr. 30 years ago, was sent to work in southern Italy. Although he already lived with my mother in the north, and a large part of the salary ended up in tickets to return by plane every weekend. The fact is that during the flight to the south, lasting about 1 hour, they do not give anything to eat except they pass with a trolley to give candies. Needless to say, the classic situation of the old woman who chokes on it and cannot breathe. My dad was called, and with a few heavy blows on the back he managed to get the candy out of the poor old woman. A week goes by and the day of the return on the plane comes. The trolley with the candies passes promptly, and out of nowhere a girl sitting in front of my father who was trying to get one is blocked by her friend. Don't take it. Last week they told me that an old woman got choked up, and to free her a doctor had to slap her really hard on the back. I like the thought of an Italian flight where everyone panics, but they find a doctor, and he assesses the situation very carefully, and he chooses not to use the Heimlich maneuver, but instead of that, professionally elects to slap her on the back, but like really hard. When I was in high school, one of my neighbors asked for my mom, a doctor, because her husband had collapsed. My mom, who doesn't practice anymore, she teaches in medical school, immediately went to the house and assessed the unconscious man. She also asked me to come with her in case she needed something. As soon as we got there, I saw that people in the house were panicking, just standing still look at the man, but not my mom. She immediately checked if he had a pulse and if he was breathing. The way she acted was so calm and so sure of what to do. I felt that the man was in good hands, and in a way made me relax. I felt that everything would be okay since she was here now. An ambulance couldn't arrive immediately, so she organized some of the neighbors to help transport the man to the nearest hospital. After that whole thing was done, my mom acted like it was nothing and just continued with what she was doing before it happened. I think that was the moment I realized how amazing doctors can be and how proud I am to have a mom like that. Eventually I went to med school myself in hopes to be just like her. Not in the medical profession, but from my time in the military I knew basic life-saving techniques like CPR and what to do when someone is drowning. My story involved my son when he was 6 years old. We were in town for my father's funeral. That night at the hotel the kids were in the pool. It was packed. He was swimming in the shallow end. Next thing I know a girl is holding him saying I think he's drowning. I pulled him from the pool, asked if he could breathe. He shook his head no. I laid him down, rolled him to his side and hit his back. He started throwing up lungfuls of water. Finally he says he can breathe. My wife is freaking out and he is white as a ghost. He threw up probably 4-5 times. Worst part is when I pulled him from the pool my first thought is I'm gonna watch him die. My wife said I reacted so fast that I had H out of the pool before she realized what was happening. I almost lost my composure when he looked at me and said thanks for saving me dad. I recommend if you can, to take some basic life savings classes. I was at a bar in NYC during Santoken a few years ago. It's like 6 PM but everyone's wasted cause it's Santoken. Packed bar. I'm standing along the wall with my friends. I look up and see this kid fall backwards off his stool. I start laughing at how fricked up this guy must have been to fall like that, then see him twitching on the ground. Oh crap. 2 of my friends were a few feet away and didn't see it. I'm like yo guys get over here, I think this guy is seizing. They're both doctors and just did the standard stuff to make sure he was okay. It turned out he was epileptic. His friends knew the drill and he was fine. I always laugh thinking back to that though. My thought process was how a drunk guy, then 5 seconds of oh crap this is bad, then an immediate realization that I had not 1 but 2 doctors with me and finally this is normal for him, he'll be fine. Not a doctor myself but my dad is a nurse. Some years ago he was dropping my sister and I off at a YMCA where we spent a lot of time in the summer while they were both working as we didn't live in the greatest area and couldn't just walk around our apartment area. As we were in the lobby a 55-ish-year-old man walked out of the gym and started clutching his chest and fell to the ground. Man's had a heart attack. My dad immediately recognized it as he works in the ER and sees this stuff all the time and began compressions because his heart had nearly completely stopped. As he was giving compressions he yelled at the stunned lifeguard to run and grab the defibrillator for him. My dad managed to resuscitate the guy before the ambulance even got there. Turns out the guy was an important religious leader in the area and invited my dad to a service at his synagogue that weekend to personally thank him in front of the community, and invited him to a personal dinner at his house with the guy's whole family. A happy ending. Amazing work on your dad's part. Not a doctor, my sister is. 15 years or so ago she was in last year of med school, had flown from our hometown to the capital, 1-hour flight, to visit her best friend and party for a weekend, and was on her way home on a plane. Just after locking the doors, while taxiing, they had the attendants call for a doctor. My sister, being rather hungover and still dressed for partying, waited a minute before she volunteered that she wasn't a doctor yet, but was close. The attendants had her come look at an elderly woman that didn't answer or really react much at all when talked to, suggesting that maybe she was drunk or on drugs. My sister examined the woman a few minutes, determined that she most likely had had a stroke, and said that they would need to go back to departures and get an ambulance. The attendant communicated this to the cockpit, and the co-pilot comes back and asks her if it's really necessary, and if it would be okay to finish the flight and have an ambulance meet them at the destination. This was a low-cost airline, and apparently it's rather expensive to turn around like that. My sister got somewhat annoyed, and said something that directly translates to yes it is. Turn this damned plane around right now. This, BTW, sounds exactly like my sister. Strong opinions and not afraid to tell anyone how it is. Either way, they turned the plane around, and the woman got picked up and transported off the plane. They started the flight and arrived back home. While taxiing to arrivals, the 50-year-old or so impeccably dressed and distinguished looking captain walks up to my then 24 or so year old hungover sister dressed in a miniskirt and low-cut blouse, looked down on her and said, "Oh, so you are the student that ordered my plane to turn around." My sis said she hadn't felt that small in many years. She did get a thank you from the airline soon after, but never got to know what happened to the patient. Happened a few years ago. My family works in healthcare, in non-medical capacities, but as a part of jobs were given CPR training. and basic first aid skills from giving stitches to blood pressure readings, etc. It was shortly before Christmas. We were at home, and suddenly there's this massive pounding at our back door, and it's one of our neighbors in a panic and said a guy collapsed. We need your help. So my brother, father and I sprung into gear. My dad flew out the door without even a jacket. December in Canada. I got on the phone with 911 and my brother went with my dad to assist. Our neighbors were walking to the post box and suddenly the hubby collapsed. Massive heart attack. The other neighbor and wife panicked and tried loading him into the backseat of the car instead of calling 911. Then the wife said go to that house. They work in a hospital, which was our house. So my dad was on the gentleman giving full-blown CPR for at least 5 straight minutes till the paramedics EMTs arrived. My dad was exhausted and extremely sweaty. Fortunately paramedics were able to bring him back, but he passed away a few days later in the ICU as too much damage was dealt. However, we learned his family were around him and were able to say goodbye when he passed. The paramedics told my dad that his actions allowed them to bring him back and allow them to try and save him. Also, breaking 4 ribs. Doing CPR will most likely break ribs. On Christmas Eve my dad was in our backyard have a smoke and he heard a group of about 30 carolers singing to the widow Christmas carols. It was beautiful. Oh, Canada, we got this. I'm not a doctor but I'm a nurse. Just yesterday morning, I heard these women screaming in the hallway of my hotel. We need help. Does anyone know CPR? I ran out the door and told these women I was a nurse. They took me to the front lobby where they found a young woman who seemed to have overdosed. She wasn't breathing but she had a pulse at first. It started to get weaker then stopped altogether. I had to do 4 rounds of CPR before I felt a pulse again, and it was right as the EMTs were walking in. I work in nursing homes and most people are DNRs. I've never had to do CPR on anybody. It's crazy, that was my first time and it was at a freaking hotel and not even work. Then you just so happen to ask this question. LOL. You're amazing. She was so lucky you were there. Transatlantic flight. Many years ago, stewardess comes to ask if I'm a medical doctor and if could I help. The walk up the plane was less than a minute, but through my mind went every scenario. A baby on the way? Surely not. Acute coronary event? Stroke? I steeled myself. I was taken to a man who looked okay. A little wheezy perhaps. I was told he had forgotten his inhaler. They had them on the plane but needed me to say he could have won. I said yes. My reward? A thank you and a free drink. It could have been worse. This has happened to me lots of times in my life. I'm currently a psychiatrist who specializes in care of people with medical issues and I work on regular hospital floors. So despite being a psychiatrist, I remain well versed in general medicine. TL. Doctor, I thankfully didn't have to do much very exciting to most people. First, medical school. Was walking home with my girlfriend and a taxi T-bones another car. The woman in the taxi wasn't wearing her seatbelt. Nobody else had serious injuries. The woman probably had a concussion, but was conscious, broke some teeth, and probably her nose. Didn't do much but made sure she stayed stable until the EMS arrived. Second, in residency, after medical school, before being fully independent, was at a dance studio and a man had a very clear stroke, with sudden left-sided weakness, confusion, facial features. We got EMS there in 10 minutes and I made sure he stayed awake and had stable vital signs. Third, residency again, but later. Man had a syncopal episode, lost consciousness, at a restaurant. Did not stop breathing, hit his head hard going down, was totally out of it after the event. Seizure or heart attack most likely. Same thing. Made sure he stayed awake and conscious until EMS arrived, noticing a pattern. Got free dessert after they got him out. Fourth, residency again. Woman had a seizure in a grocery store. Full shaking, drooling grand mal. Protected airway. Got her on her side. Kept her safe until EMS arrived. Fifth, residency. Homeless guy found bleeding and confused on a train. Made sure he didn't pass out and, you guessed it, stable vital signs until EMS arrived. Sixth, residency. Pregnant woman on train got low blood sugar. Watched vitals and luckily someone had a banana and water to give her. Watched her until EMS got there. Seventh, more exciting. Fellowship year, optional special training after residency and before independent practice. Air India flight from Delhi back to the US never been. Was amazing trip. Flight attendant calls for a doctor. Nobody else, at least awake, on the plane responds. Woman in first class with severe stomach symptoms. Vomiting, sweating, intense pain. Air India is fairly well stocked and had good anti-nausea medication. Was most likely food poisoning. She wasn't from India and had some street food before the flight. Crew had a surgical kit and we're a little too enthusiastic about the possibility of my needing to use it. I checked on her several times and she stayed stable throughout the flight. Did need several rounds of nausea diarrhea meds and used their whole supply of vitamin nutrient enhanced fluids. Got a bottle of champagne leaving the plane. That's all to date. I appreciate how you explained what residency and fellowship actually means. My family and I were at Disney World sitting outside the Garden Grill waiting for our table when all of a sudden a server comes out of the restaurant and briskly walks by with a frantic look on her face to grab a defibrillator off the wall right in front of us. I pipe up and ask, is that for real? Does someone need that? And she responds, unfortunately, yes. She was obviously super stressed because of what's happening and also the fact that Disney World is supposed to be a happy place. So she's trying her hardest not to draw attention to some sort of crisis despite dozens of people watching this unfold. I immediately offer, well, we've got 2 doctors here if you want. My dad and brother, without giving it much thought, because she's in a hurry and focused on what's going on. She reluctantly goes up, sure I guess. Follow me. So they go in there to check it out. I stay outside with the rest of the family as we look at each other like WTF is happening. After what seems like forever, my dad and brother come back and they're like, everything's fine. It turns out an elderly gentleman passed out while eating and fell out of his booth and into the walkway. When my dad and brother got there, he had woken up, so they checked some stuff, pulse, vision, memory, etc. to see if it was something serious but didn't find anything. I'm not sure what exactly caused it, but they said that he said he would be fine. So they left it at that. The meal ended up being pretty awesome cause a bunch of characters came by and thanked us as best they could, without using voices, obviously. We got a bunch of free food and as we were leaving the server lady came up to me to thank us again and gave us some free picture frames and signed pictures of the Disney characters that were there. I worked at WDW and probably called 911 a dozen times. Was even told to pull the defibrillator once and had to stay on the line with the operator and tell them each time the patient took a breath until paramedics arrived. Not me, but my brother is a doctor. On a flight back from a medical conference, they announced over the PA that if anyone was a doctor, they were needed up front. The 4 doctors on the plane all went forward, and it was a toddler that was running a fever. None of the doctors was a pediatrician, but the 4 of them figured it was an inner ear problem from the flight along with teething. Some children's Tylenol was found, and everything was fine. He's also done the Heimlich on someone at a restaurant. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.